Welcome to Pivot Point, Strategy for Change. I'm Nick Michael. Every family eventually reaches the moment when college stops being an idea and starts being a decision. And that's usually when things get complicated, because most families arrive at that moment operating on assumptions about what colleges want, what test scores mean, what a scholarship actually requires, and what a degree is actually worth. Those assumptions were built over the years, shaped by their own experience, by what they've heard from other parents, by the stories that travel through communities and sound like wisdom. Some of those assumptions still hold. A lot of them don't. This is the Gen Z Launch Gap, a series built around the distance between what families expect and what Gen Z actually encounters in college, in the job market, and in the longer, harder process of becoming an adult. This first episode is about what happens before any of that, the decisions made or avoided while students are still in high school, the ones that quietly determine what options are even on the table. My guest today is Darren Meyers. Darren spent more than 2 decades inside education. He taught physics, worked directly with students, and guided families through the college admissions process from the inside. From the outside, it looked like exactly what it was: a stable career built on real expertise and genuine investment in students. But over time, Darren started to see something that the institution couldn't fully address. The process families were being guided through wasn't keeping pace with what students were actually walking into. The advice was often well-mentioned, but misaligned, built for a landscape that had already shifted. So he stepped out. He built Meyers Advising to work with students and families the way he wished the system allowed, directly, honestly, and without the constraints that come with working inside it. What Darren brings to this conversation is something rare: the perspective of someone who has seen the college admissions process from the inside and now helps families navigate it from the outside. He's not selling a school. He's not managing a caseload of 400 students. He's sitting with the families who are most confused and most at risk of making expensive, preventable mistakes and helping them make better decisions before the pressure makes it harder. This conversation is about where families get it wrong, where they get it right, and what it actually takes to prepare a student, not just for a college application, but for what comes after it. Have you ever faced a moment that changed everything? A loss, a new path, or an awakening that forced you to rewrite your life? Pivot Point is a podcast that explores those stories. I'm Nick Michael. We'll dive into how pain can spark growth and how crisis leads to clarity. Subscribe to Pivot Point today. Welcome to Pivot Point, Strategy for Change. I'm Nick Michael. Darren, it's great to have you here. I'm really excited to have this conversation. Thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome, Nick, and thank you for reaching out to me, inviting me to be a part of this project that you have going on. So thank you.
Yes, this is really exciting. I think you play the most pivotal role, it seems, because you're where it all begins. When we think about the college admission process, or even after college, the career, it really begins, well before. I wanted to first bring up, there are a lot of misconceptions about Gen Z. I was just going to pull up the question for you to take a look. And from where you sit, what is the most damaging misconception you actually see about Gen Z? And what do you think is true instead?
I think, and maybe this is sort of kind of generalizing, sort of broader, to sort of those who sort of grew up, right, with the internet, with smartphones, and sort of having the world at their fingertips, so to speak, is that, it can be assumed, right, they're not open to or willing to invest in something in depth and with passion for an extended period of time because they're so accustomed to having an immediate answer. And I found that in my work with high school students, primarily in the 11th and 12th grades, is that because this particular journey, right, is about them, that they do invest and they do understand that it's a process that will evolve as they understand themselves better and they understand what they want better. And they know that it's not going to happen right away. And so I think that sense that, that they're so accustomed to instant gratification that something that takes a while to understand what you really want would be perhaps too daunting a challenge. I found in my work with high school students that's not the case.
I see. So how do you attribute this? It almost sounds like a lack of patience and trusting the process and that instant gratification. What's your sense of that?
I do think, to some degree, it's almost, well, the question of sort of relevance. How is what I'm learning in school relevant to me, relevant to the real world? That's always, I think, been present for young people. I think the ability to so quickly get an answer, right, sort of raises an additional question, just like, why do I even have to bother learning this when I can just look it up? And so I think those are real concerns. But for the kids who really buy into the idea that not only going to college, but the process of understanding what kind of college experience they want to have is a real learning experience, they see the value in that and understand that knowing what they want, knowing who they want to become, right, isn't, right, going to be necessarily a question that has an immediate answer, especially if they find themselves drawn in multiple directions and wanting to sort of explore all the options in front of them.
How has college admissions process changed in the past 5 to 10 years? And what do you think families most often misunderstand about where it stands today? I'll leave it up for a moment.
So I think the biggest shift that's happened within the last decade has been a shift from college admissions to enrollment management and the role that the admissions office plays in helping manage the enrollment of students at the college or university. And so to understand sort of the difference there, when folks in the industry, whether they work at a college or university as an admissions officer, or if they're on the so-called other side of the desk and working, in a high school or as an independent educational consultant, when we talk about admissions, it's almost with sort of this nostalgic kind of look towards a time when all of the adults who are part of this process were invested in helping students understand what kind of college experience is going to be the best for them. And that there was sort of, an open-mindedness, particularly on the college side, that there was less of a concern about admitting a student who they felt might be right and could take advantage of their programming, even if there were other signals, whether the strength of that student's academic profile or whatever it might be, that might suggest that student may never enroll at the university. Historically, there was much more of sort of a willingness to kind of play the risk there. And the statistic that sort of that is around that notion of risk is what's known as yield. Right? The percentage of students who are admitted who actually enroll. And each institution is going to have a different way of ascertaining how many students they need to offer admission to in order to hit their enrollment targets. But more recently, hitting that enrollment target right on the nose has become increasingly important. In part, it was a response to the costs associated with mitigating COVID-19 during the pandemic. And also those experiences when institutions ended up enrolling more students than they anticipated, and then there's costs associated with housing those students and whatnot. And so I think very much now, colleges are acting with a much more determined eye to recognize sort of what their budgetary constraints are. And because of that, they want to hit their enrollment targets spot on. And so not only are they wanting to admit students that they feel strongly will choose to enroll, they're making much greater use of the wait list than they had previously to hit those enrollment targets. And so because of that, it can be sort of much harder for students and their families to anticipate how am I going to put together a list of colleges that's going to work for me and ensure that I have options. And particularly for the strongest students, identifying those what we would call middle or target options has become increasingly more difficult, in part because every college at every level of selectivity is seeing far more applications and has become harder to get into. And so I think the biggest thing that parents in particular underestimate about the process is just how many more applications the admissions offices are reviewing, how competitive the applicant pools are, and just from a numbers game, right, how hard it is to gain admission. Along with that, one of the challenges that sort of students have is being able to separate, right, their ability to thrive on a particular campus, either academically, socially, and extracurricularly, and recognizing that that is independent from whether or not they're going to get in. And that's probably the biggest challenge that students face.
Do you think, I appreciate hearing that, do you think the Common App and how easy it is to apply to multiple colleges has increased the number of applications?
Certainly. Back when I applied to college in the mid-90s, the Common App did exist. There was a much smaller number of institutions that were part of it, and it was a paper application. It was a trifold application, and you filled it out either by hand or with a typewriter, and then you made copies of it. Now it's online. And so because you're applying right at the click of a mouse, it's much easier to add an additional application, right? You don't have to make another copy of the application or anything like that. Multiple copies is sort of embedded into the system. And so that is a part of it. And then I also, as students sort of recognize, geez, it's going to be, harder for me to get into, into the kinds of places that I most want to go to, a lot of students sort of naturally end up casting a wider net. The more schools students apply to, though, the harder it is to articulate why you want to go to a particular college. There are some costs associated with applying to the 20 colleges that the Common Application has spots for.
Right. You're listening to Pivot Point Strategy for Change. If today's conversation resonated with you, take a moment to subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. It truly helps others find the show and supports the work we're doing here. You can find Pivot Point Strategy for Change on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you'd like a deeper dive into the work we explore on the show, I invite you to visit my Substack page, where I share in-depth articles and reflections. Hey, curious to get your thoughts on this. When do you think families should realistically start having serious conversations about college and career direction? And what does starting too late actually cost a student? What does it mean to start too late? And when is too late? Or is it ever too early?
So, all of these questions really are, it's hard to generalize because every student's an individual, and depending on how your child, is developing, maturing, it may be appropriate to start talking about college related things in middle school. But I think that now, if we think about like talking about college and sort of the preparing to apply to college piece of it, really I would say the idealized time to sort of start doing that college planning in terms of planning on like applying to college really should begin in the spring of the 10th grade. Is the time to think about preparing for standardized tests has sort of crept right into the spring of 10th grade from the fall of 11th grade. So, and to some degree, that makes a lot of sense, right? Because by and large, right, the math that both the ACT and the SAT are testing is more 9th and 10th grade math, than it is 11th grade math. for kids who are sort of on track to be taking pre-calculus or calculus in high school. And so to start the test planning in the spring of 10th grade is certainly not too early. But if you wait to do it on the more historical, traditional timeline of initiating that in the fall of junior year, it's not like you're behind. It's just that, you do, run, I guess, to some risk that maybe you're not done with standardized testing until early fall of of 12th grade, when ideally it'd be nice if it's all wrapped up by spring of 11th grade. I think, how late is too late? It again sort of depends on the child. I've worked with plenty of kids who just had a real hard time sort of recognizing A, that high school is going to come to an end for them, and that B, the next thing that came after that was college. And so for a lot of kids, it really doesn't click, and they don't begin to sort of more fully invest in the idea that they'll be applying to college until they see their friends who are a year ahead of them in high school begin to go through the various rites of passage in the spring of senior year, whether that's a celebration of, the senior class at some, events in school, prom, graduation, those kinds of things are the signals like, oh, I'm a senior, I'm going to be applying to college. So, that definitely does sort of ratchet up the pressure in terms of you have to accomplish more in a shorter period of time. It's very different to be sort of contemplating the kinds of college visits that you want to be making kind of over the course of the entirety of your junior year versus trying to kind of race through it in the summer before 12th grade and the early part of the fall of 12th grade.
Yeah. Earlier, you brought up standardized tests. I have a question on that. I'd love to get your opinion on that, because this is where many of the kids tend to struggle as to the decision about what to do about it. And in short, how do you advise students and families on standardized testing? When the SAT makes sense? When does the ACT, when is that a better fit? And how to decide whether to test at all? And as you know, during COVID time, and I guess a couple of universities after continued it, they kind of abandoned the standardized tests. Am I correct about that, or is that?
Yeah, certainly, during the pandemic, there was a very pragmatic recognition that, because of regulations and test centers not being available and things like that, right? Students just couldn't sit for the exams. And so, the number of institutions that, went test optional and didn't require test scores as part of the application, went through the roof. But as we've gotten further away from the pandemic and the implementation of test optional policies at many universities, there has been a move towards restoring the testing requirements. And so to some degree, right, I think there'll be sort of the diehards that were test optional for decades, well before the pandemic. They'll remain test optional. And I think as colleges and universities look at the data now that they've got, several class years through, can really ascertain, if by looking at other metrics, they're able to assemble a class that can succeed and thrive on campus. Each institution is going to make that decision in their own way, but more and more institutions each year are moving towards restoring their testing requirements. So the advice for families is to prepare to take a test. As to which one is best suited to a given student, I sort of kind of put that trust in the folks who are in the test prep space. And by taking diagnostic tests of both the ACT and the SAT, a student can kind of identify which test their test-taking abilities are better suited for. Certainly, the digital SAT being shorter has drawn the attention of lots of kids because it's not as daunting an exam as the ACT has been historically. It's been shortened a little bit to address that sort of competitive edge the shorter digital SAT has. And certainly, the ACT is going to have to moving towards having a digital test as well. Each kid's going to find one of the tests more appropriate for them to take.
I appreciate that response. It's a tough decision, but you're saying no matter what, be prepared to take a test? And would you advise them to take the PSAT or to take those practice tests of the ACT? What do you recommend? Should they
Yeah.
try
So
one or the
yeah,
other and then see where their strength is?
yeah. I think it's worth families finding test prep companies that offer the diagnostic tools so that they can discern which of the two exams fits the student best. And again, as I said before, the timeline for doing that, right, is crept into the spring of the 10th grade year. The realities are, right, if we look at what the applicant pools look like at most colleges, right, half of the applicants will apply with test scores and half will apply without them. When we look at who's admitted, as the admission selectivity of institutions increases, right, the percentage of admitted students that applied with testing increases in kind. And so the more selective colleges and universities are admitting more applicants who applied with testing. And then, of course, in the test optional era, right, the students who are submitting test scores are students who tested very well. So those middle 50% ranges have all gone up because the students who tested lower, by and large, are not applying with those lower test scores. So it does kind of make it a little bit harder to identify what a quote unquote good test score is. But there are some correlations between a generalized level of selectivity in terms of the overall admission rate, and then what one can presume is likely to be a good score for that kind of institution.
Appreciate hearing that. I want to show you an article. So college tuition rises now above $100,000 a year. And if we take a look at the schools themselves, and I remember roughly Fordham and NYU were about 75,000 in 2019. And I remember Colgate was the same. And Wellesley. Now they're well above the. So we've been moving toward this six-figure price tag for a long time. And we're here for a lot of people. It's significant, from Jeffrey Salingo.
Yeah.
Is it sticker shock? My real question is it worth it? This is my real question. Hold on. Should families think about cost versus the reputation of a school? And what does the data actually say about return on investment from what you know?
Right. And so I think the first thing that families need to understand is that the vast majority of students are not paying that full tuition. And also, like, the full cost of attendance often exceeds the stated tuition. So that's the sort of the first piece of it, is to recognize that in almost every case, students and their families will not be paying, right, the published rate of tuition, which is why the New York Times columnist Ron Lieber, right, who he writes about, that's his career, he writes about this all the time, right? He says that college is sort of the weirdest consumer product out there, because you don't know how much it's going to cost until, right, they've decided that you can purchase the product. Until a student is admitted, will they learn what, right, the cost of attendance is going to be. So it's one of those things where it becomes hard to make that decision, right, in advance of applying. The federal government mandated that all institutions have a net price calculator on their website. So it is certainly worth, plugging in some rudimentary sort of financial information just to get a sense, right, of what the expected amount that families are going to be paying for college will likely be. But to get to your question of, like, is it worth it? And I think, and this is just me speaking as myself, I think one of the unfortunate sort of realities of how higher education has evolved over time is that it has moved away from its sort of initial founding principles, right, of helping young people, although admittedly originally it was largely young men, right? Learn about the world, learn about themselves, right? So that they could become informed citizens. Not, the fact that they could make a successful living, was sort of a byproduct. Right. It wasn't the mission statement. And if you look at the mission statements of colleges and universities today, right, it isn't related to career by and large. They have much more lofty sort of humanistic aspirations for their students. But the reality is that our lives and our culture and our economy has sort of moved towards college being not only a time for exploration and personal growth, but a time for acquiring skills to become prepared for a career. And so that raises the question of sort of, is it worth it? And when the prices get that high, because even if the original cost of tuition is over $100,000 and your student qualifies for, a $30,000 tuition discount, and we're kind of back to that 70,000 figure from several years ago, but that's still a lot of money. And the question sort of becomes, well, what are we really getting for that money? And so if it's seen only through that lens of career preparation, right, one could argue that, well, maybe it's not worth it. Although, the lifetime earning gaps between folks who attend college and those who don't certainly makes a compelling argument that it's worth going to college. But that only really sort of comes into play like if you persist in college and you graduate and you earn a degree. Unfortunately, what happens for a lot of students is that the realities of life, or whether it's the realities of loans or whatever, right? They start school, but they don't finish, right? And that's when how much higher education costs really can become sort of a devastating burden for students and their families. So we're unfortunately sort of at this moment where, even though historically, right, a college education has been the so-called ticket into the middle class, the realities are such that if things continue to progress in this direction, is that colleges, will be even more so kind of the playground, if you will, for the well-to-do. That's certainly how they started, and then they moved much more towards a democratizing, right, influence on society. But as college costs have risen, it's kind of returning in kind of back to being kind of bastions of the wealthy again. And so I definitely understand why families would be hesitant about investing in college when, with the growth of micro credentials, right? There's lots of ways to accrue kind of the career preparation training that you might need to get a pretty decent job. And so, I think it will require, to some degree, a reformulation of what it is that colleges and universities are offering to students and their families. And I think, every student, their family, is going to make a determination about that, for themselves. But there are so many things that are gained by going to college, right, that are above and beyond sort of that career preparation lens, which is sort of where, right, the notion of return on investment comes from. Because really, like, it's hard to quantify. It's hard to put a value on, like, right, how much of a better human have you become? But it's far easier to identify, all right, how is my earning potential increased? And so, I understand the mindset that a lot of families bring to this.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I want this, what you said is very important for young people to hear. What's the value for them, and make that decision. You brought up the actual price tag, and then let's say with scholarships. So let's talk about that. What is the realistic landscape for scholarships right now? And additionally, where do families have unrealistic expectations, and where do they leave money, let's say, on the table? I'll leave that up for a moment.
Yeah. So I think, right, one of the things that students and families can oftentimes sort of misunderstand, or the misconception about sort of scholarships, is sort of a thinking that if I get a large enough one, or accumulate enough sort of smaller ones, right, then I could, right, in theory, cover, right, the entirety of my, right, cost of attendance. But when colleges, financial aid offices, right, evaluate a student's ability to pay for college, any scholarship monies that they earn or are awarded, right, right, that increases the student's ability to pay for college, and then therefore will decrease whatever scholarships in the form of grants, right, that the student does not need to pay back, unlike a loan in which they would need to pay it back. And so I think that in that sense, students and their families oftentimes will not understand that, oh, if I get all these scholarships, right, that's going to get added to what I would get from the college. But oftentimes it will reduce the amount that the college will provide because the student has got these other funding sources. And so, I think scholarships definitely play a very important role for a lot of students in terms of helping cover additional costs and things of that nature. And that's not alone is not a reason to just, put scholarships to the side, but just sort of recognizing that the more scholarships a student earns, the less institutional aid they may receive because it's coming from somewhere else. And so I think that as students and families kind of like search, right, for various scholarships that they will qualify either based on certain characteristics, demographic characteristics of their identity, or things that they do extracurricularly. Every scholarship sort of has its own way of identifying who the targeted recipients are going to be. And then you just sort of want to look at, what's being asked of me to get this scholarship, and is sort of the time and the effort to complete the application, right, worth what's going to come on the other end. So it may, at the end of the day, be far easier for a student to kind of go after, say, 5 $1,000 scholarships than to go through the process to acquire a single $5,000 scholarship. But the only generalized rule that I would say to families is that if a scholarship has an application fee, right, that is a real sign that is a scholarship you do not want to be applying.
Okay, that's good advice. I appreciate hearing that. I have one question about what you were talking about here that really relates. What matters more in admissions today? Is it the GPA, standardized test scores, or extracurricular involvement? And how do you advise students about preparing for that? Let's say they do come to you in the 10th grade. What if a family has worked with you already with the older one, and they're coming to you now for their younger one? So they have an idea. Maybe it's not the same exact track. Maybe it's not sports. Maybe it's another leadership type roles in Key Club or other kinds of extracurriculars that are going on. How do you demonstrate to them what would be the best beneficial kind of path if they want to go that route?
So I think, and part of I read an article that was posted to LinkedIn this morning about this, right, is that one of the consequences of sort of evaluating, right, what one does in high school, right, in terms of its, right, potential payoff, right, in college admissions, right, is that through a cynical lens, it's sort of like gamifying, right, the high school experience. But in reality, what it does is that it can, depending on the student, right, it can steer them towards things that they feel like will look good for college, right, and disregard, right, the things that they enjoy doing, that they're passionate about, and that they have a lot of fun with. Just sort of kind of misunderstanding what the point, right, of the college application is, which is for the colleges and universities to know and understand who the applicant is. And so I think when families are considering sort of, right, what should the extracurriculars be, right, the extracurriculars should be what the student is drawn to doing and the things that they're most excited about. Should there be sort of an assumption that students are going to be doing some sort of service work? Yes, but how that service work kind of takes shape really should be a function of where the student's interests lie, and to connect, what their kind of natively passionate about. But to get back to your original question, which is sort of like, what is the most important part of it? Like, if the application, right, is a pie chart, the biggest part of the pie is the student's academic profile. The bulk of the academic profile is determined by the transcript. And so that's the rigor of the courses that the student has taken, and the grades that they have earned in those courses. And so that's where kind of the local context of the student's high school, right, becomes important. Right. Because depending on where a student lives and what's offered at their high school, right, what the most rigorous curriculum is, right, could be, very different. But one of sort of the kind of the unintended consequences of admission to very selective so-called elite institutions is they've kind of shaped the high school and teenage experience sort of across the country. And so that mantra of, taking the most rigorous set of courses available to you in your high school and do as well as you can in them, right, has become certainly universal for students and families for whom, right, the goal is to go to college. And it's definitely kind of shaped how they look at high school. And so the guidance there, needs to be what is most appropriate for the development and abilities of the student. It's not worth it to push into a harder so-called honors class if you're not going to be successful in it, or just the work that you would need to do to be successful, right, is going to impact your ability to be just as successful in your other courses. So
I'm glad you're putting it that way. That's important, I think, for parents and mainly to know, because I think they're the ones who are encouraging students to go too far. Although when you have a high achieving student, they often want to separate themselves. My concern is that sometimes they may sacrifice their grade point average in order to get a class or to be part of a more advanced class that they run the risk of not performing well.
Yeah.
What do you say to someone about that if they're shaky about that? Again, let's say somebody's been working with you and over time, and they have time to decide this.
Yeah. So if we're looking at, those most elite, ultra selective, I like to say ultra rejective institutions where they're only admitting a very small percentage of their applicants and they're rejecting everybody else, the expectation is that not only are you taking those hard, more rigorous classes, but that you're succeeding in getting, essentially all A's in them. And so where this process can feel the most unfair, for lack of a better word, is for students who are appropriately at that level, right? But, they're earning a B or a B plus in those honors classes. And so there is sort of this nuance in that there are a set of still very selective institutions that are going to reward the student for taking a more rigorous, course and being successful in it, even if that success did not mean getting an A in the class. And so, it's by and large is more beneficial to take those harder classes than to opt not to. And so all things being equal, if a student has the option to take the harder course and they can kind of handle it, it's not going to impact their other coursework, then it is better to take it than to not take it.
All right, I'm glad you said that.
So, but it's about kind of recognizing that one may need to kind of moderate where one's setting one's sights, right? If you're not able, to be a top performer in those hardest classes.
What industries or career fields do you believe students should be paying closer attention to over the next decade? I'll leave that up for a moment.
Yeah. I think it's this question, right? And the uncertainty that's associated with it is, I think, what's driving some of this sort of fear and concern around what's the right thing to be studying. To some degree, right, the fields that are always going to require a human, right? One could argue those are the quote unquote safest ones. But I think it's still too early to say exactly where the tools that are being developed with AI are going to be best deployed, most successfully deployed, and the impacts that they're going to have for how many people, right, a company is now going to hire because they're utilizing this. I think the goal, by and large, right, is that the AI tools make, right, processes more efficient and better so that humans can accomplish more each day, because sort of, the lower level tasks that require a lot of time, can oftentimes be done much more quickly, right, when employing the appropriately trained AI system. So I think when we think about those fields that really do kind of rely on human creativity, human ingenuity, one can argue those fields, right, are likely to be the safest. And so whether that's kind of the personal relationships that are at the heart of really any good medical practice, or within education, thinking about the teacher-student relationship, there's a lot there. I think historically, one could look at sort of the most sort of human-centric professions, and our culture oftentimes undervalues those, so one doesn't necessarily earn as much in those fields as you might in some other one. But given the way in which our culture is moving, I think data science is an expanding field. Being able to look at data sets and understand the patterns that exist in them, and what that means in terms of the choices humans are making and how that connects to sort of solving the problems of the day, or the problems of tomorrow. I think to some extent, every field is going to be accommodating some of that data analytics in it, because that's right. I think we're certainly, in the sort of the moment of the data revolution. And I think that is certainly a burgeoning field for sure.
That's important to hear. Everything you mentioned is so valuable, and I appreciate hearing that. So if you could tell every parent one thing they don't know but need to hear about what this process is, what would it be? What do they need to know that would be valuable that you could offer them?
Yeah. And I think, and I'm certainly not the first person to say this. I think I probably heard it on a podcast with Harlan Cohen, but it's oftentimes students and families will kind of approach the college application process through a lens of, right, what are the colleges looking for? What do the colleges want? So, and this relates to the earlier question about extracurriculars and things of that nature, of students sort of trying to mold themselves into this image that they think, right, the colleges are looking for. Far better for students and families to be looking at it from the lens of, what do I want? Which colleges and universities are offering the programs and experiences that I'm looking for? So that it becomes less about the student tailoring themselves for the college, than rather gaining a better understanding about themselves and who they want to become, so that they can identify the colleges and universities that will help them do that. And I think the more that students sort of approach it from that standpoint of, I want to find the colleges that are going to help me become the person that I want to be, rather than what do I need to do to become the person the colleges are looking for, I think that's the most important way to approach this process. Because it really is an educational process where students really come to learn about themselves and what they want.
You're listening to Pivot Point Strategy for Change. If today's conversation resonated with you, take a moment to subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. It truly helps others find the show and supports the work we're doing here. I appreciate hearing that. It is a journey. It is a process. As you know, when you probably experience some of what I'm about to present here, oftentimes I get parents who are bringing kids in, and they're not sure what direction they'd like to go into, and trying to find themselves. And I came across a book, and I want to pull it up. It's called The Disengaged Teen, written by Jenny Anderson and Rebecca Winthrop. And in short, they have a description here, really, of what the crisis is are truly engaged. There's about 4% of teens feel truly engaged in school, highlighting a profound disconnect between students and their education. 50% are in what they call passenger mode. Uh, what happens is, what I'm finding is, children are being called lazy. They're they're not living to their potential. They refer to the passenger mode, which is coasting, the achiever mode, which is high performance, but also encompasses some hidden stress. There's a resistor mode that avoids and is defiant and withdraws. This is what I usually tend to get, or the passenger mode. And then you have the explorer mode, which really, I think you're talking about, being curious. And now I get them in different stages as well, but this passenger mode, they coast through assignments, they do the bare minimum, they don't take ownership for their learning, they appear calm and easy to manage, but they can be highly anxious. The achiever mode looks successful from the outside, but it masks anxiety, fear of failure. The high achievers, burnout. Adults should notice when the achiever mode is driving, because it's being driven by pressure, high performance, hidden stress, risk of burnout. This resistor mode, they avoid tasks and responsibilities, defiant towards adults and authority, withdraw and act out, communication issues, misconduct. And then you've got the explorer mode, the guy or the girl who asks questions, wants to understand, is intuitive, persists, challenges ownership, takes ownership, purpose-driven. There's a lot that they talk about what adults can do. But in short, the question comes down to, let me bring up the one I want. This is my question for you. My question for you is, when a student fits the passenger or resistor profile, how does that change your approach to college and career counseling? And what pitfalls do you need to be mindful of?
Yeah, I think, certainly one could argue that there's a lot of kids sort of in that kind of passenger mode, where they're just sort of swept along by kind of the wave of progression that took them from elementary school through middle school to high school, and then the next stop, right, on this ride, is college. Whether or not the student has really thought about what kind of experience they want to be having in college, they know that's what's coming next, and so they'll identify a set of criteria that kind of drives sort of that. And it may or may not be indicative of that explorer mode, where they are eager to understand more about something they've identified as a subject area they care about. I think where it changes things, is about the kinds of conversations that you have with students. And you really are kind of pushing it right back on them, right, to identify what it is that they want. And so I think, to some degree, right, the coasting along and more actively resisting things, is sort of a certain amount of frustration of just doing what they've been told to do. But then, right, in this moment, they really have, to some degree, way more freedom, right? And for a lot of kids, that increased freedom, that optionality, right, can be scary and, overwhelming, and maybe even paralyzing. And so I think where the nature of those conversations shifts is it's geared towards, right, being curious about what the student is excited about and helping them open the door to learn about the stuff that they are excited about, and help them become confident that there are things that they want to do, that they're looking forward to doing, and to see how this next phase, whether it's college or whether it's more specific kind of career preparation, that things can shift from that high school experience of having a whole bunch of requirements that you need to meet, whether you want to or not, or are excited about things, and moving in a direction where you have much more elective choice about what you're doing, whether that choice is going to college or not, and, helping students navigate that level of control that they have.
I want to get your thoughts on this then. Have you found that students who begin as a passenger or resistor, can they successfully transition to being the explorer type, or even, what do you think is the catalyst?
Yeah, I think so.
I'm trying to figure out if we can give hope to some parents, because they're concerned and they're worried. The kids are not taking an active role. They
Yeah,
want them to do more than they could. All parents see their children as having greater potential than the kids actually believe.
yes.
They struggle with Kids struggle with believing in themselves. I think that's okay though that parents see a potential. I think if we didn't see that potential as parents, we wouldn't persist past, I believe in you, I know you could do this, I know who you are. And I think there are a lot of things that get in the way, just generally speaking. But what are your thoughts on that, just to give some hope, if there is hope?
Yeah, because I think, when you invest your emotional energy and your curiosity in the child and what they are excited about, I think it can be helpful because there's a lot of things that could be behind, a student's reluctance to really engage with applying to college. It could be that when they think of the idea of introducing themselves to a whole bunch of strangers, through a piece of writing, that they may feel as though there's so many questions they have about who they are and that they don't even know how to begin to tell that story. And it can become much easier for them to tell the story of why they're excited about something that brings them joy. And so, as you remove sort of each stumbling block or hurdle along the way, it can help pivot and reframe how they're looking at this point in their educational journey. And it shifts from being something that they feel like they're being forced to do, and can move them towards recognizing that it actually is something that they want to do and can become excited about.
Are parents too involved in college application process, and what does over involvement cost a student?
So, I think over involvement, it costs the student their burgeoning independence. And so obviously one of the telltale signs of over involvement is, when a parent will talk about how we are applying to whatever college. I think the role of the parent is best as a supporter and a guide to create the space, both physical and emotional, for the student to discover what it is they want and who they want to become. I always tell students, at certain points, there's going to be compromise here. You may have to, apply to a certain school, right? Because it would make your grandparent happy or whatever the case may be. But at the end of the day, I think what too much involvement in this process does, it robs the student, of their agency over this process, They're no longer doing it to discover their own happiness and their own pride, but to meet, somebody else's expectations, And it's one thing to apply to, a school or two because mom and dad insist, that you're going to apply somewhere. But I don't want students kind of giving up the reins of this process, to their parents or their guardians, because it really has to be the student's voice, that comes through it. It kind of, to some degree, and maybe this kind of gets back to that initial question you asked, but there is a kind of a growing industry, of this surrogate mom for college age kids who will, go get them chicken noodle soup and get them, cough medicine when they're coming down with a cold because, God forbid, the student figure out how to do that stuff for themselves. So there's always this sort of push and pull between supporting your children, but you don't want that support to get to the point where you're doing things for them. And I think that's where the over-involvement can become. And this process really should be fun. It should be a process of exploration. And if there's too much checking in, how are you coming along? How are you doing this? And then all of a sudden it becomes this burdensome exercise and a real tension point in the household. And so I often advise families to have, particularly as their students get older and are in the process of applying to college and filling out the applications, to really designate ideally one night a week where, okay, this is where we're going to have the college check-in conversation. That's the opportunity for mom and dad to ask the questions that they have. And then, the rest of the time is just sort of to step back and really let their student take ownership over the process.
This was much needed for parents to hear what you just mentioned. So I appreciate hearing that from you. So if you could give Gen Z one piece of advice to actually succeed in today's system without losing who they are in the process, what would it be?
I think, and obviously this is a piece of advice that's far easier to give than it necessarily is to take, particularly, for students and families, who live, in the kinds of communities that I grew up in and I live in, and that I worked in when I was working in a school. And, I think in his writing, Jeff Saligo kind of refers to this group of people as being in what he calls the panicking class, is that there are thousands, right, of colleges and universities across the country. It's right to focus in on the very small number, right? It's only about 150, maybe 200, depending on kind of where you put the upper bounds of very selective at. And, there are so many really wonderful, high quality, right, institutions, right, that, would be really excited to have you on their campus if you only were open-minded enough to discover them. And so in the same sort of way that you approach this, with the sense of hope that the colleges that a student applies to will see how great they are in their application. The flip side of that, is that students and families need to recognize, right, that there's far more greatness out there than the way in which the media covers college would suggest. And I think as students come to identify those things that they really get excited about, and pursue those with depth and passion, that they're going to end up at a place that's going to help them grow into those passions and really feel good about who they are and who they're becoming. And so I think, oftentimes the image I kind of think of about, trying to make some sort of, right, countercultural move about whether it's where in the country you apply to college or the types of institutions you apply to college. It's kind of like that classic photograph of the lighthouse with the waves crashing around it, and the waves are as tall as the lighthouse. Oftentimes that's what it can feel like, right, if you're doing what feels right to you, even if it's, different than what the cultural norms of your school and your town is. And so my hope for students is that they develop the confidence to have the courage to go after what they want and not rely on other people to identify what they should want.
So well said. I appreciate hearing that. You mentioned that author. I recently saw a small clip on Smerconish, and this is what his book is: Who Gets In and Why? And then his next book is Dream School, and finding the college that's right for you. I think this is him here. I'm not going to play it. I just thought I'd pop it up as a recommendation to parents who are looking for some guidance. Before we close, tell me what you imagine is important for us to mention here that we haven't brought up that might come to mind right now, if you need a moment. Anything else that we haven't covered, either for parents or for what parents need to know about their high school students, kids who are applying.
We've certainly covered a lot of ground, right?
Yeah, I appreciate this.
I think, the one thing I didn't mention when we were sort of talking about the increased costs of college, that part of the conversation sort of focused around this idea of, right, is college worth it or not? But I do think, given how expensive college is, it is really important that parents and guardians have an honest conversation about what's going to be financially possible, right, for them. And, once you've sort of identified what's, right, a doable, manageable number for your family, then really hold fast to that. Recognizing that, the published price is not necessarily and almost always is not going to be the price that you'll pay. But that's where, reaching out to the financial aid office becomes really, really important. And I think what an important distinction, right, is that, yes, the admissions offices, right, they are the so-called gatekeepers. They're determining who gets in and who doesn't get in. The financial aid office, right, does not play that role. Their role is within kind of the constraints of their institution's budget is to help make, right, the institution financially accessible, right, for students and their families. So if paying for college is a real concern for the family and they're not just, relying on the fact that they have enough money to afford it, even if they wished it didn't cost as much as it does, that when you visit a school, include a visit to the financial aid office, because the financial aid officer is very much on your side. They may, right, there may be limits to what they can do for you, but they're going to try to do as much as they can to make the institution accessible to you. So I would say that's the one piece that's sort of that's missing for families for whom the cost of attendance is going to be a real critical factor in their decisions about where a student will ultimately go, is to recognize that the financial aid office is on your side and is your ally, and to ask the questions that you have about the cost of attendance, to learn about that, because they're on your team even if they're employed by the college or university.
I appreciate hearing all this. This conversation can go on and on, and I always look forward to speaking with you. And I know I plan to continue this series in different types of segments, and I know if the opportunity arises, I do want to contact you and include you again for additional opportunities to discuss this further down the road. I'm considering doing a panel and different types with other professionals who are working with Gen Z. But Darren, thank you very much for speaking on Pivot Point Strategy for Change. Very valuable information for parents and their kids applying for colleges.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. I appreciate the invitation to join you in this conversation, and I hope that all the people that watched this episode of the series found it informative and learned something.
Yes, I would say they would. And thank you again, and I look forward to contacting you and speaking again. Thank you again.
Yep, sounds great. Thank you, Nick.